This is Gesher, the podcast that's bridging the gap between the Jewish and evangelical Christian communities with conversations that matter. Here's your host, Ty Perry, with the Friends of Israel Gospel Ministry.
Well, hello, everyone, and welcome to this episode of Gesher, and I want to thank you for joining me. As you may know, we at the Friends of Israel are committed to combating anti-Semitism and to educating audiences, especially evangelical Christians, about its dangers and its rise. This summer, Mosaic magazine published an essay entitled From Coy to Goy, How America's Far Right Found Its Anti-Semitic Voice and Figured Out Its True Identity. Here to talk with me about that essay is its author, Tamara Behrens. Behrens is Director of Young Professionals Programs at the Tikva Fund, an ideas institution committed to supporting the intellectual, religious, and political leaders of the Jewish people. Behrens is also co-director of Tikva's Krauthammer Fellowship, and is a contributor to Mosaic magazine. She graduated from King's College London with a Bachelor of Arts in War Studies, and her writing has appeared in publications in the US, UK, and Israel, such as National Review and the Weekly Standard. At Mosaic, she writes about anti-Semitism and Jewish life in America, and I'm honored to have her on the program today. Tamara, welcome to Gesher.
Thank you so much for having me, Ty.
Well, Tamara, when I first read your essay, it struck me because it so clearly articulated what I, as an evangelical and as a political conservative myself, have anecdotally deduced, which is the mainstreaming in the West of what was once fringe, far-right anti-Semitism or anti-Semitic ideology. But for you, this phenomenon is more than secondhand, and you write about this in your essay by discussing your own encounters with anti-Semitism, encounters that ultimately led you to flee the UK and to come to the United States. So would you tell us a little bit about those encounters? What did you witness? What did you experience?
Absolutely. So when I was growing up in London in the United Kingdom, we were experiencing kind of the height of the effects of the war on terror, the Iraq War. And really during this time, I think the crystallization of an association of the State of Israel with really the specter of evil of kind of American foreign policy, which was, in my view, a very unfair association. And I wouldn't make that judgment of the war on terror or the Iraq War. But I think that it became more and more acceptable to essentially call Israel out, as the source of this evil. And in some cases, really as the instigator people felt of this kind of unjust war. And obviously living in the United Kingdom, in closer proximity to the Middle East and with large immigrant populations, a lot of this hatred really took hold on the ground. And so the way this manifested for me was both, as a child, sort of hearing things in the playground, things that parents had passed on to their children, these sort of stereotypes about Jews that really took hold, and I think led people to treat me differently as someone who was Jewish. And then as I grew up, going into university on a college campus, I attended King's College London, which is a very large university in the center of London. There was a convergence of pro-Palestinian activism, both in the university space, but also just in London as a city in general. And so on my end, what I wanted to do as someone who was Jewish and who believes strongly in the State of Israel and its flourishing and wants to celebrate it and promote engagement with it, my goal was really to bring speakers to campus to educate both students and also, people in the sort of broader public living in London that wanted to attend. And what I witnessed there were just huge organized protests against really any action that myself and my peers on campus tried to take to deepen engagement with Israel. And this often led into violence. So you had people throwing chairs at windows when speakers were trying to give their points of view. And then this converged with a political reality in the United Kingdom where, leftism was on the rise, and it was manifested in a very, really a far left leader of what was once a mainstream political party, the Labour Party. And so, the pro-Palestinian activists, the sort of anti-war activists, of which Jeremy Corbyn, the leader of the Labour Party, was very much representative. These people actually had political power in Britain in terms of dominating really the institution of this party. And so I think for me personally, it just sort of got to the point where I didn't see a future for myself in a country in which, public perceptions were so aligned against my beliefs. And so coming to the United States was really a dream come true for me. And I'd always believed strongly in the conservative movement in the United States and its power to not only to keep out anti-Semites, but to be, a vehicle for a strong support of the state of Israel, of the relationship between the U.S. and Israel. And so that's what's been somewhat worrisome in terms of the time frame of me, moving here, embarking on my professional career here, and then actually encountering anti-Semitism of different strains, more so on the right of the political spectrum, being here. So I'm happy to talk more about what that looks like.
Yes, well, I want to talk about that because in your essay, you write about the change that you witnessed in our nation's capital in Washington among conservatives over the course of a 5 or 6 year period, particularly in regards to the kinds of conversations you would have with fellow conservatives as it pertained to Israel and other issues. As a conservative myself, and most evangelicals are conservative, we like to think in our dream world that anti-Semitism is held captive by the left, that we would never see manifestations of that on the right. Obviously, that's untrue. So talk a little bit about those conversations that you're having among fellow conservatives. How did those conversations change during those years for you?
So one of the things that was so attractive to me about the United States was really being able to engage with Christians in the conservative movement in ways that I wasn't able to in the United Kingdom, which is a very secular country. And religion isn't really incorporated into politics in any way, even though that there isn't separation of church and state. And so I was very excited to encounter, when I first spent time in Washington, D.C., evangelicals and Christians of other denominations who were very keen to talk to me about either their experiences already having visited the state of Israel or their future desire to visit the state of Israel, and talking to me about the political realities of the relationship between the U.S. and Israel. And this was just something that kind of dominated a lot of the conversations that I had with people that I interacted with in young professional circles in Washington. And then I spent a little bit of time away from Washington during the pandemic, and coming back a few years ago, it seemed as though the landscape had suddenly just dramatically changed to really worrisome ends. And I think really in that period, the end of 2018 through the pandemic, obviously January 6th, I think unfortunately you saw a growth of really a hostility, not only to the state of Israel, but I think to a lot of, America's allies abroad, and really also the growth of conspiracism that I think just, grew exponentially during the pandemic. Obviously, there were a lot of unfortunate associations between COVID-19 and the Jews, but also measures to counteract the spread of the pandemic and the Jews. The Jews were kind of scapegoated in many ways. But at this time also, there was this fringe group on the right that started moving further and further to the center, I think really taking advantage of this sort of shift to conspiracism that might have grown among the American population as a whole. You had things like QAnon, which is a set of conspiracy theories that has waned now, but during the pandemic held, I think, really worrisome degrees of interest among the public, which I didn't expect. And so what happened was, coming back to Washington, D.C. From then and through to the present, a lot of my conversations with conservatives, really of all stripes, are more geared towards worrying about the US-Israel relationship, being worried about the state of Israel, rather than celebrating that relationship. And it's been something that has been quite, sad to see at the level that I operate in. But it's also maybe concerned about it may be concerned about everything that I wasn't seeing. Obviously, I'm surrounded by people who are fairly, comport themselves in professional ways. They are kind of, genteel in the way that they interact with people. And then there's this underbelly online that I wasn't initially so familiar in before embarking on this journey of writing this piece. But as soon as I started, digging into that and seeing the extent of the rhetoric against the Jewish people online, against the state of Israel online, in spaces that people on the right of the political spectrum tend to occupy, that's when I really got concerned. And I'm worried, frankly, that things will only continue to get worse if something isn't done.
You write, and I quote, "For a while, I assumed that my conversation partners were members of or sympathetic to the alt-right, the internet-based movement of discontents, meme creators, and neo-Nazis that reached the height of its influence and infamy in the early years of the Trump administration before the response to their 2017 march in Charlottesville drove its members back into their online underground and deeper into their own monoculture. But it is now 2023. You go on to point out that alt-right is something of a defunct term now. So let's step back in time just briefly and define that term. What was meant, at least at that point, by alt-right? What was meant by that?
Yeah, so the alt-right stood for people who rejected kind of the conservative and Republican establishment leading up to the 2016 presidential election. So these were people who felt that the Republican Party had failed in sort of not going far enough on a whole host of different issues that were important. And their sense was that, culturally and politically, America was kind of on the brink, and that there really needed to be this sort of radical shift in order for various aspects of American society and culture to be saved. And so for them, they were extremely anti-immigration, often anti-Semitic, but not always so evidently so. And they associated themselves to a degree, with white nationalism. A lot of the figures that were sort of around the alt-right, meaning that they felt that America ought to be organized as a country for whites, excluding to a degree non-whites, and politically, emphasizing that fact as kind of the key unifier of the country, which obviously, goes against my beliefs, but also that was something that was very much not just not tolerated. It just wasn't, relevant to the Republican Party at the time. However, the alt-right began to sort of, converge with Donald Trump. They really seized on Donald Trump as a candidate that they felt like could be a popular vessel for what they believed in. And of course, he never, directly identified as being of the alt-right. Donald Trump never said, this is, the group that I am a part of. He was able to kind of shapeshift and be everything to everyone. But that's who the alt-right was in 2016, and they targeted people like Ben Shapiro, who's a very prominent conservative writer and speaker, with anti-Semitism on Twitter. This was also the rise, obviously, of social media, the rise of a platform like Twitter, and Ben Shapiro was, I think, shocked to see kind of the prevalence. The prevalence of really the tweets targeted against him. There were just tens of thousands of them, and it seemed like there was sort of a network of bots, or really an organized coalition of people that were engaged in trying to kind of expunge some prominent Jews from the right at the time. But the key thing is, I think in 2016, is that there really were a lot of prominent conservatives, Republican figures also speaking out against the alt-right. And it was something that, there was a really strong understanding across the political spectrum that this was something that we shouldn't be in favor of. And it was kind of relegated to sort of a fairly fringe community. at that time.
Now you mentioned the kind of a white supremacy that was inherent in the alt-right, and also in your essay you mentioned there are anti-immigration, not only illegal immigration, but immigration. They associated that with the Jewish people. But you bring out something that was surprising to me. I guess I'm naive, but as an evangelical, my conservatism is largely rooted in a biblical Judeo-Christian worldview. But you write that for the alt-right, one of their core stances, and I'm going to quote you here, was a belief in paganism, both in itself and as a tool for uniting an irreligious white far-right base. So in your view, where does that paganism come from, and how did that paganism on the alt-right affect their view of the Jewish people?
Yeah, that's a great question. Thank you for bringing that out. It's something that was very surprising to me. I think that paganism on the alt-right really comes from the decline of religion in America, religious affiliation, belief in God, membership in religious communities, which is, unfortunately waning, as we know. And paganism is essentially a clever organizing tool to kind of try and replace the role of religion. You have some people on the alt-right, though, like Richard Spencer, who's kind of stuck around actually perhaps as a member now of just the far right in general, since the alt-right itself has dissipated a bit. Mm-hmm. And someone like Richard Spencer, who's very smart, is really trying to use paganism as a tool to his advantage on an intellectual level, and build an alternative framework for what it means to be a member of a community in the United States. And so to someone like him, it's really emphasizing the role of men in society. So, from a biblical framework, for example, encouraging people to have children is done so in a way that I think really elevates the entire family unit.
Yes.
Both mother and father having children in a traditional sense, ideally with the support of extended family and community. But what we're seeing on, the alt-right and then the far right today as it grows is really this emphasis on just the male role and sort of men needing to kind of take back their own sense of manliness in society, and basically, having children with multiple wives, for example. That's something that a lot of people in this kind of pagan circle have espoused. And the reason for this is they see this sort of urgency in populating, America with more people who are white. And so for them as white males, they obviously reject the Bible, they reject religion, they reject God altogether. And their argument is that they need to promote whiteness instead. And so to me, it's such an empty thing. I mean, I really don't believe in racialism of any sort. Right. I don't think that the white people are automatically conferred with superior characteristics.
It's unbiblical not to mention that. Yeah.
Absolutely. It's completely unbiblical. I mean, I just think it's wrong. And I think it's very dangerous, obviously, because it leads to, terrible conclusions about abortion being acceptable for other races, but not for people who are white. I mean, it's very disturbing. And so this is something that has sort of started with Richard Spencer, but I think now has proliferated to different spaces, and unfortunately more mainstream spaces as we move away from 2016 and going through to the 2020 election, and now gearing up to the next electoral cycle, and just seeing the way the right is going. I think that perhaps some people on the right are quite cynical about the possibility of a religious revival in the United States, or just of increasing belief and membership in religious institutions and communities. And so instead, they're turning to this sort of white nationalism as a replacement for that's the thing that will make America distinctive, rather than being, a country that is in favor of religious freedom and the flourishing of religious communities, which to me is a lot of what America is. And instead they see, the path for America, the path for the right, as being, really somewhere that focuses on the flourishing of white people being superior to other races, and having that be kind of what undergirds their identity. So that's one thread of it. But also, I mean, and we can get to this a little bit. There are some people that are rejecting that in turn and are starting to sort of try and, in some ways, sort of marry this white nationalism with a kind of phony, in my view, Christian nationalism. But they're
Yes.
sort of starting to try and use these kind of Christian terms, or just pander to it by just, I mean, in some cases, just saying the word Christian. There's really nothing to me that's Christian about it. And when you scratch under the surface, you see that it's kind of this white nationalist identity that they're sort of trying to rebrand in a way that they think will be more popular.
Yes, well, I want to talk about that because in your essay you write about some of these markers of a shift from the alt-right to the far right of today. And as you noted, one of those is that they take already existing religious, especially Christian symbols and terminology, and they apply it to themselves. And it's, of course, about an inch deep. There's no theological underpinnings to that, but they're getting traction by using those things. So I want to talk about that, but especially in the context of anti-Semitism, how are they channeling some of that Christian imagery to bolster their anti-Semitism?
Absolutely. So some of what I'm about to say will likely contradict a lot of what I just explained about the rise of white nationalism. And I think that just speaks to the extent to which anti-Semitism is a shape-shifting tool, and just in general, conspiracism on the right
Yeah.
has continuously shifted to try and do whatever it can to take hold among the American people. So specifically with the adoption of white nationalist, with the adoption of Christian symbols, it's very concerning because, again, it's something that they will quote from scripture on occasion, but it's not as though they've had to do any deep, searching to really find what they're looking for. I imagine that it's probably nothing more than, spending time on Google and finding something that confirms what they're trying to promote. And none of these people seem to really be part of religious communities. So someone like Nick Fuentes, who is in his early 20s, he is a live streamer who seems to kind of live really in his basement, in his parents' basement, or in some kind of property that he's managed to buy with, unfortunately, a large amount of funds that he's amassed from people that donate to him based on his live streaming. He is someone who identifies as Catholic, but it's unclear what that really means in terms of how he lives his life. And he spends his time really just spewing hatred against the Jewish people and against the state of Israel, and trying to promote a vision of conservatism that is entirely opposed to the American support for the state of Israel and the place of the Jews within the conservative movement in America. So he focuses on taking the Judeo out of Judeo-Christian, which is very interesting because that's something that would be quite hard to do.
Almost impossible.
in practice. Yes, absolutely. And so, if he was actually a member of a religious community and attended church, I think he would realize how wrong that is. And but I think that probably speaks to the solution to a lot of these problems. But he essentially argues that Judaism is the cause of transgenderism. It's the cause, obviously, of the birth of the state of Israel, which he says is a racist entity. It's an anti-Christian entity. He'll sort of make up anything that he can, really, to associate Jews and Israel with some of the worst ills that are plaguing American society today, and just kind of point his finger. And it's extremely concerning. You see also this reflected, I think, in politics. And that's where I really started first, actually, to take notice that there's increasingly individuals that are being elected to serve in Congress who, some of whom are, friendly with this person, Nick Fuentes, who sort of created a movement, the America First movement, as he calls it. Marjorie Taylor Greene, congresswoman from Georgia, spoke at Nick Fuentes's conference, the America First conference a few years ago. And she really pandered to the audience, an audience which, by the way, is just full of men. This is a movement that is primarily geared toward men. They seem to be men who are unmarried and who are choosing not to have families and not to prioritize family life, but instead to live this sort of chosen, or you could say forced celibacy. So it's very concerning, and that's a whole other online movement that we could get into. But I think seeing it reflected in Congress and seeing someone like Marjorie Taylor Greene, someone like Lauren Boebert, again, they'll sort of quote from scripture, but they'll it's incorrect. I mean, Lauren Boebert, she read a passage about wantonness. She read the word wanton as wonton, like the Chinese food, a wonton, a dumpling. And she was like, was that meant to say wonton? I don't know what that means. And it's evident that they're sort of using and relying on these texts to really promote what's actually quite an insidious political ideology. And they don't actually have any interest in serving Christians and serving Christian communities. But they think that, by putting the word Christian on their set of beliefs, or by tapping into what they describe as a Christian nationalism, they can essentially kind of sanitize what really I think is a form of white nationalism, which has proven to be unpalatable to the American people, which I think is obviously a good thing. But I'm concerned that if they rebrand successfully as Christian nationalists, that perhaps they might be more successful in fooling people that are, for whatever reason, naive and are looking for a sense of meaning. And they'll say, oh, I can be Christian if I vote a certain way, and if I take on this political point of view that the United States needs to regain its identity from Jews and immigrants and so on and so forth, and we need to be a Christian country. But what does that really mean? It's actually very empty, and it has nothing to do with really being a member of a community and attending church and being someone who lives their life, by a set of principles to be found in the Bible. So it's very concerning to me.
Yeah, whenever I hear about such anti-Semitism among people who shrouded in Christian terms, I always think, do you know that Jesus is Jewish? Do you know? You obviously don't know the history and the theology there. Otherwise, you wouldn't want to adopt that. In your essay, you term anti-Semitism, quote, the uniting force of the American far right. Why do you term it so? What do you see as, because as you're talking about this, you have the paganists, you have people who are clouding their, or cloaking their anti-Semitism and radical beliefs in Christian terms, and yet you're saying that anti-Semitism unites all of them. Why is that?
Absolutely. So these are all very different streams, as we've really discussed. And there's very little that they actually have in common. And that's partly because they have very little principles. A lot of these people are what you might call grifters. They're, trying to make a career for themselves. They're trying to kind of make their fortunes, and they want their names out there. They want to be seen, invited to meet President Trump at Mar-a-Lago, like Kanye West and Nick Fuentes, the person that I just mentioned, did. But they actually don't have a very strong political program. And so I think what unites people like this is really anti-Semitism as a political tool to try and gain more support. It's unfortunately the case that people are often taken in, again, if they don't have good sources of meaning in their lives, they're taken in by conspiratorial rhetoric like anti-Semitism. It feels good to be able to blame all of your problems on another entity. It feels good to be able to say, if we just, got the Jews out of the Republican Party in the United States, if we just made sure that the Jews don't have their religious freedom, if we just stopped our support for the state of Israel, well, then we could be a great country again. That's sort of the argument that each of these disparate groups are offering. That's really what they have in common. So they each have different ways that they might sort of, different terms that they might clout this in. some of whom, for some of whom that's white nationalism, for others that's Christian terms, again, not meant very sincerely. But I think what unites them is this kind of conspiratorial set of proposals, essentially, to just suddenly solve all of the ills that America faces by focusing on the Jews. And it's very concerning, obviously, because, as someone who's Jewish, that is a direct target against me, against my family, my way of life.
Yes.
But I think it's also concerning for America as a whole, because when you have, really so few principles and such little meaning in your life, that all of your focus politically is on targeting a group of people, the Jewish people, who've really been oppressed for so much of human history, and who are now finally able to gain a lot of flourishing, both in the state of Israel, but also actually in the United States as well, which has offered really blessings of just religious freedom to the Jews, being the first country to do so in a significant way. To see that being challenged, I think it really is a direct challenge to the framework of the United States. I don't want to see a reality in which political participation means nothing more than, blaming all of your problems on really an imagined group of people, because the Jews that they talk about are not real. I mean, they're actively lying about what the state of Israel does in many cases, pretending the state of Israel is an apartheid state, which is something that we traditionally would see from the left, but that people on the far right are talking about. And they're lying about the US-Israel relationship as being something that was supposedly set up just to serve the state of Israel, when actually, in fact, the United States benefits greatly from, supporting the state of Israel in the Middle East. That really just only confers benefits on the US's regional interest there. So it's something that I never thought that would be a unifier for a political movement in the United States, but I think that for the far right, that's really increasingly the case.
Well, let's turn to the future here in our last few moments. We have a presidential election coming up, which promises to be bloody, as they all seem to be anymore. In your essay, you write, and I quote, "Speculation about the future aside, the broader point here is that anti-Semitism, even as it remains both officially and pretty widely denounced, is less likely to be a point of weakness on the right in 2024 than it is a weapon." That's a chilling prediction. It's one I think you're right about. But why did you write that? What are you seeing that makes you say that it's more likely to be a weapon than a point of weakness?
Yes. So I think the future of the right's comportment in electoral cycles does not look very good, unfortunately. I think Donald Trump's candidacy and presidency has kind of led way to increasing infighting in the Republican Party and to the use of really dirty tactics. And so anti-Semitism has been used as a political weapon before. It's something that I noticed in the United Kingdom, where I grew up, as we spoke about a little bit at the beginning, in that the Labour Party, the left-wing party in the United Kingdom, would actively use anti-Semitism as a recruitment tool, really, to kind of get people riled up and to unify, again, kind of disparate groups of people that didn't really have very much in common other than this shared hatred of the Jews. And so there's two things that I'm really worried about as we head into the next election cycle. So the first is that a political candidate might seek to paint their opponent as being too supportive of the Jewish people and too supportive of Israel to the detriment of the American people. And so, while the Republican Party has for the last few decades been very supportive both of the state of Israel and of the Jews, fighting anti-Semitism on the left and dealing with a lot of security concerns and terrorism concerns, really, against the Jewish people. I think there's this sentiment that's growing that, we really need to roll back our commitments to other countries, and Israel doesn't have a special place um, for the American people, and we should decouple from that. And so, for a candidate who's seeking to exploit a lot of that public sentiment, they might want to paint their opponent as a supporter of Israel at the expense of the American people.
Sure.
That's the first thing that I'm worried about. And you've seen it in terms of there's a man by the name of George Soros who's primarily a funder of many left-wing institutions, but there was some efforts actually to associate Governor Ron DeSantis, with this man George Soros, essentially, in saying that he's in bed with this person because he supports the Jews more than he supports Americans. Which, I mean, none of those things. It's not true that it's not true that Ron DeSantis is in bed with George Soros,
Right.
and it's also not the case that George Soros is a supporter of Jewish or pro-Israel causes. So the whole thing is sort of fabricated. That's the first thing I'm worried about. I think the second thing I'm worried about, which might seem less obvious, is just anti-Semitism being used as a political football by people who are seeking to tar their opponents really with kind of bigotry without there being much actually of substance that's there. So you saw that with Breitbart writing an expose about someone by the name of Pedro Gonzalez, who is an influencer, again, associated with Ron DeSantis. And Pedro Gonzalez has made some really just noxious comments about the Jews, saying things like, it's a shame that most Jews aren't, tolerable, and we need to kind of exonerate people who espouse anti-Semitism with the movement because they have so much good things to say about other areas. The problem with how this was handled was that the entire piece by Breitbart was really written as an attempt to exonerate Donald Trump from anti-Semitism. So it was sort of comparing DeSantis and Trump and saying, well, this man Gonzalez, who's very close to DeSantis, has done this, and Trump has actually been a champion of the Jewish people and has always stood against anti-Semitism. And it just makes the Jewish people into really a political football. Essentially, it's evident that the expose never really cared about the substance of the anti-Semitic remarks, but the entire thing was an attempt to tar the DeSantis campaign with a specific brush. So that concerns me. I think it would be preferable for anti-Semitism to be something that doesn't have to be discussed to this extent in politics.
Yeah.
Again, it's something that historically has been less of a problem in the United States than in most other nations around the world. And so it's always really worrisome to me when this becomes the primary mode of evaluating a specific candidate. How anti-Semitic are they? Are they close to the Jews? Are they close to the state of Israel? To me, these things should really just be a given across American society, that Americans should support the state of Israel, that they should have friendliness towards the Jews, and it shouldn't be something that's up for debate. So seeing that it's increasingly being debated on the right is very concerning to me.
I'd like to close with this. As we've noted on a personal, you yourself are Jewish. You fled the UK to escape, in part, anti-Semitism and to be part of the political world here. But in light of the changing socio-political, we can even say religious to some extent, climate here in the U.S., what kind of a future do you see here for American Jewry? And I know this goes beyond a little bit the scope of your essay, but as you're looking at these trends, what do you think the future is?
So the trends don't really impact my personal sense of optimism. So I say the trends are very, very negative, but I try and remain optimistic overall. And that is because I do think that there is this deep relationship between the United States and the Jewish people, and it's something that's really been evident since the founding of the US as really a haven for religious liberty, at a time where that was by no means evident in other countries around the world. And I think so often in the history of this great country, you've had both the founders and the framers of the American Republic really see themselves almost as the ancient Israelites. You have, Abraham Lincoln, one of the greatest statesmen, in my opinion, often invoking the Jewish people and Hebraic morality. And, I think that this will stand the test of time beyond the trends that we're seeing on the right. I hope so, at least. And again, I'm trying to be optimistic because I have such a strong love for this country. At the same time, I do think that there is a lot that needs to be done in really strengthening and in some cases just building from the ground communities where that no longer exists. Because to me, really the greatness of the United States is enabling people with shared values, but radically sometimes different ways of enacting those values with the means to live a meaningful life and being free to do so. But increasingly, we're seeing that, communities really being the bedrock of this, because I don't think people can live a meaningful life alone in their basements on the internet. Communities are being, decimated by various societal factors, but also just, I think, by, perhaps a lack of, in some cases, internal investment. And so for me, as someone who is Jewish and I consider myself to be religious, I live a fairly traditional life, that's something that I want to see strengthened. And I think there's a role that, both Jews and Christians can play in their own communities, strengthening internally and also reaching out to others who might not be attending a church or a synagogue and encouraging them to really, see the role that faith and that membership in communities of faith can play in their lives. And that to me is the solution to a lot of this madness on the right.
Tamara, I want to thank you, first of all, for your essay, for so articulately expressing and exposing the mainstreaming of anti-Semitism on the right. It should certainly be alarming and worrisome for all Americans, especially those who are truly politically conservative. But I want to also say, for myself as a follower of Jesus, and I'm confident that I speak on behalf of many thousands of other evangelicals, that I'm proud to be a friend and an advocate of the Jewish people. And please know that we stand unabashedly and unconditionally with your people. And so we thank you for your time. Thank you for all you do and all that the Tikva Fund does for the Jewish people. Thank you.
Thank you so much for your kind words.
You've been listening to Gesher, a ministry outreach production of FOI Equip, your free resource for learning and engaging with the scriptures from a Jewish perspective. To learn more, visit foiequip.org. And for more information about Ty, visit foi.org/Perry. Until next time, may the Lord bless you and keep you. Shalom.